Welcome to Life Stories, where the stories of struggle, triumph, and the complexities of the human spirit unfold. In today's tale, we dive into the life of Emma, a passionate lawyer caught in the battle of a lifetime. As she fights for justice, she finds herself confronting not just a broken legal system, but her own personal demons. Will she prevail? Or will the weight of the world crush her resolve? Join us as we explore this powerful journey of truth, redemption, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Please subscribe to the channel to begin today's story. The courtroom was still. The kind of still that made your skin prickle and your heart race. All eyes were on Judge Bradley Mason, who, perched high upon his bench, was casting a gaze that felt less like scrutiny and more like the weight of a judgment already made. His sharp eyes met mine, and I could feel the condescension dripping from his every word. "Miss Walker, are you aware of where you are?" His voice was thick with mockery. The words seemed more like a challenge than a question. His gaze piercing through me like I wasn't meant to be in that room at all. I shifted uncomfortably, my sneakers squeaking slightly as I stood. The papers I clutched in my hands felt heavier by the second, their weight growing as if the eyes of the entire courtroom were pressing down on me. My fingers trembled, but I steadied myself. I was prepared for this moment, though I never imagined it would feel so much like standing on the edge of a precipice. "This is a court of law, not some high school debate team," Judge Mason continued, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. A ripple of laughter spread across the room, low, mocking chuckles from the attorneys who had been seated behind their desks. They exchanged glances, perhaps expecting me to break under the pressure, to fold in the face of a system that demanded so much more than a 16-year-old girl could ever offer. The truth was, I didn't belong here, at least, not in the traditional sense. I wasn't a lawyer. I hadn't spent years in law school or passed the bar. I wasn't even old enough to drive legally. But that didn't matter. Not today. I stood tall, letting the weight of the room, the stairs, and the judgment roll off me. I refused to let them see the nerves that were twisting in my stomach. "Your Honor," I began, and though my voice was calm, it felt like the sound of it had to fight its way out of my throat. I had no legal title, no letters after my name, and I wasn't even certain whether I was allowed to be here in the first place. But I knew something none of them did. Judge Mason's hand waved dismissively. "Save it," he sneered. "This court doesn't have time for juvenile antics. I don't even know why we're wasting time on this nonsense." I swallowed. The laughter in the room felt like a punch to the gut. But I didn't flinch. I met his gaze with steady eyes, chin raised just enough to remind him that I wasn't some fragile girl who would buckle under his insults. "If you would let me speak, Your Honor," I said, "you might find it worth your time." There was a sharp intake of breath in the courtroom. How dare I speak like that? A teenager, standing in defiance of a judge who had the power to end this before it even started. Judge Mason's smile faltered for a moment, but he leaned forward, his voice now dripping with mockery. "Well, by all means," he said. "Enlighten us all." The room fell silent. For a fleeting moment, I almost wondered if I had made a mistake. But I had come this far. I had prepared for this. For everything. And I couldn't turn back now. I took a deep breath, adjusting the stack of papers in my hands, and began. What happened next still sends chills down my spine when I think about it. I spoke without hesitation, without fear, as though every word, every legal precedent, every clause I had studied in the past year was written in my blood. My hands, trembling only slightly now, flipped through the documents with ease, citing case after case, referencing constitutional clauses and court procedures as if they were second nature. I wasn't just quoting facts from textbooks. I was living them. The attorneys who had once laughed and exchanged amused glances were now scribbling notes furiously. Their amusement had turned to a quiet disbelief, their pens moving quickly across their notepads. They weren't just taking notes on my words, they were scrambling to keep up with them. Judge Mason leaned forward, his smug expression slowly changing to one of disbelief. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "Who are you?" His voice had lost its earlier mockery, replaced instead by genuine bewilderment. I met his gaze, my own expression calm, but my heart was racing. "I'm Emma Walker," I said, a slight smile tugging at my lips, "and I'm here to defend my client." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Questions flew in every direction. How could this be? Who allowed this? A teenager, standing in the defense of someone's life. No formal qualifications. No license. What was going on? Judge Mason banged his gavel, demanding order, though his usual air of authority was no longer present. It was clear that the tide had shifted. He was no longer in control. His composure, so carefully crafted just moments ago, was gone. And for the first time, I saw it, the fear in his eyes. For the first time, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for my client. I was fighting for something far more personal. Something deeper. But then, just when it seemed like everything was falling into place, a flicker of hesitation crossed my face. The courtroom fell into silence once again. But this time it was different. All eyes were on me, not in awe or disbelief, but in expectation. Something was coming. Something I hadn't planned to reveal. The courtroom was silent. All eyes now fixed on me. It wasn't just the weight of the judge's scrutiny anymore, it was the realization that I was standing in a space I had no right to occupy. No one expected me to be here. No one expected a 16-year-old to know this much about law, to wield legal knowledge with such precision and confidence. But there was something else pressing in. Something deeper than the weight of legal texts or case law. It was a burden. One I hadn't been ready for. One I didn't ask for. But one I was now carrying, whether I liked it or not. A deep breath escaped me. The kind that came from somewhere far below the chest. As if my lungs were trying to rid themselves of the weight pressing in from all sides. I glanced down at my papers, letting my fingers graze the edges of each sheet before slowly stacking them neatly. The motion was meant to give me time. Time to center myself before I plunged into whatever came next. For all the knowledge I had, I knew that this was only the beginning. A young girl, barely into adulthood, standing in defense of a man accused of a crime I believed he didn't commit. I hadn't fully understood the complexity of this responsibility when I took the case. And now, standing here, it felt like an immense weight pressing against my chest. The glances, the whispers, the murmurs, everything around me felt like it was pushing me toward an edge I wasn't sure I could handle. Judge Mason's voice broke the silence. His earlier amusement had faded into something more professional. But there was still that undercurrent of doubt. "Miss Walker," he began, his voice now lacking the mockery of before, "I'm afraid we need to discuss something more important than your argument." His gaze shifted slightly, and I caught the flicker of something else in his eyes. It was subtle. But it was there, concern. Maybe. Or was it simply a new form of judgment? I nodded, steeling myself. "Of course. Your Honor." "What is it?" Mason leaned back, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair. "I have received some troubling information. The evidence we have against your client, it's overwhelming. You cannot expect to win this case simply by quoting textbooks." His words landed like stones, one after another, sinking into the pit of my stomach. It was true, my client's guilt seemed all but certain. The evidence, the witness testimony, the timeline, they all pointed in one direction. It was only a matter of time before the full weight of the accusation would fall on him. But I couldn't believe it. There was something wrong here. I couldn't put my finger on it yet. But the more I looked at the evidence, the more I questioned its validity. The witness statements didn't line up. The timeline had holes in it. There was a flaw in the way the police had conducted their investigation. Something that I couldn't overlook. I met Judge Mason's gaze again. Your Honor, I believe there's more to this case than meets the eye. My client's involvement is not as clear-cut as the evidence suggests. I want to request permission to dig deeper into the circumstances surrounding the case. A ripple of murmurs ran through the courtroom at my boldness. How dare I question the very evidence that seemed to have condemned my client? But there was no turning back now. I was already deep in this. And I would not let my fear hold me back. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about the truth. About justice. About something much bigger than myself. Mason seemed to weigh my words carefully before responding. I'll allow you to investigate further, Miss Walker. But be warned, you are walking a dangerous line. If you dig too deep, you may uncover something that you are not prepared to handle. His words felt like a threat. But I knew they were more of a warning. In this world, truth wasn't always kind. Justice wasn't always just. But I had come too far to turn away now. I could feel the weight of the world settling on my shoulders. And in that moment, I made a vow to myself to see this through, no matter where it led. After the judge gave his ruling, the courtroom dissolved into chaos once more. Lawyers murmured amongst themselves, exchanging uncertain glances, and I could hear the heavy footsteps of the bailiff echoing as he approached me. I didn't know how to feel. The idea of digging into this case, of finding whatever hidden truth lay beneath the surface, felt like a daunting task. It felt like stepping into a labyrinth without a map, blindfolded, uncertain, and alone. As I made my way out of the courtroom, the weight of my decision became clearer with each step. I had agreed to take on a responsibility that was far greater than I ever anticipated. I wasn't just defending my client anymore, I was defending the truth itself. And somewhere, buried beneath the lies and the half-truths, I knew there was something important waiting to be uncovered. I couldn't let fear or doubt stop me from finding it. The journey ahead was going to be long, filled with twists and turns I couldn't predict. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to give up now. Not when I had come so far. The next few days were a blur of frantic activity. I pored over the case files until the words blurred together on the page. I ran the timelines in my head again and again, trying to find the flaw, the one thing that could change everything. But the more I looked, the more the truth seemed to slip further out of reach. I wasn't alone in this. At least, I didn't feel alone though. If I'm being honest, there were moments when I wished I could be. Everyone I reached out to was supportive, but they were also distant. My colleagues at the firm offered encouraging words, but their attention was divided, consumed by other cases. My family, as always, was well-meaning, but they didn't understand the nuances of the legal world. No one could truly grasp what it felt like to be at the heart of this battle, with everything hanging on a knife's edge. The case was not just about the facts anymore. It was about something bigger. Something I had only begun to understand, the cost of making the right choices. It was late one evening when I finally found it. I had been rereading the witness statements, trying to spot any inconsistencies, when I came across something buried within the lines of a seemingly trivial detail. A phrase. A sentence. The witness had claimed to see my client at the scene, but the timing didn't match. The person had testified that they saw him at a certain time, yet there was irrefutable proof that my client couldn't have been there at all. It was small, almost inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, but it was a crack, a tiny opening in a case that seemed airtight. And once I found that crack, it opened up an entire world of possibility. This wasn't just a mistake, this was deliberate. Someone had fabricated the testimony. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. The witness had lied. And now, I had a choice to make. I could expose the lie, but that would put me in direct conflict with some very powerful people. I could back down and leave well enough alone, keeping my own life safe and simple. Or I could push forward, knowing the cost of that decision might be greater than anything I was prepared for. As I sat there, staring at the file in front of me, I realized that this was not just a case. It was a test. A test of who I was, who I wanted to be, and how far I was willing to go for what I believed was right. The weight of that decision settled over me like a thick blanket. Could I stand by and let an innocent man go to prison? Could I live with myself if I didn't fight for the truth? The answer was clear. But the path forward was not. The next morning, I went to see my client, Jason Edwards, in prison. I had spent countless hours reading about him, but seeing him face to face was different. He wasn't the hardened criminal that the media had painted him to be. He was just a man, scared, uncertain, and, above all, desperate. Desperate to prove his innocence, to regain his life. I found something, I said to him, sitting across from him in the sterile, cold visiting room. His eyes widened, hope flickering briefly in them. A witness lied. The timeline doesn't match up. I think they're trying to frame you. Jason didn't speak at first. He just stared at me, as if trying to process what I was saying. And then, slowly, his face softened. Are you sure? I nodded. I'm sure. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as though a weight had been lifted off his chest. You don't know how much this means to me, he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. I didn't do it. I swear I didn't. In that moment, I felt a surge of something I hadn't expected: empathy, not just for Jason, but for anyone who had ever been wronged by the system. By the very people who were supposed to uphold the law. The law wasn't perfect. People weren't perfect. And yet, it was all we had. I had to make this right. I couldn't back down. But the road ahead was treacherous. As I left the prison, my mind raced with the potential consequences of my decision. Exposing the lie meant putting everything on the line: my career, my reputation, and even my safety. But it was the only way to ensure that justice prevailed. I couldn't let fear stop me now. There was no turning back. The days that followed felt like an endless, exhausting whirlwind. I spent every waking moment preparing for the court case, delving into every scrap of evidence, questioning every word that had been spoken, every document that had been filed. But no matter how much I investigated, no matter how many hours I poured into the case, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running against time. Time was something I had no control over. Each day that passed seemed to bring me closer to a point of no return, where one misstep could destroy everything. The truth I had uncovered had made the case even more complicated. It wasn't just about proving that Jason had been wrongfully accused, it was about exposing a deeper conspiracy. Someone in the system, someone I had once trusted, had manipulated the evidence to frame him. And that wasn't something I could ignore. It wasn't just my career on the line anymore. This was bigger. This was about justice itself. I knew I had to take this to court. But with each decision, I could feel the walls closing in around me. The higher-ups at the firm were pressuring me to settle the case, to take a plea deal and avoid the mess of a trial. It's not worth the risk, they told me. Think of the consequences. Emma. Think about the clients you could lose. The reputation you could damage. They didn't get it. I wasn't thinking about reputation or clients. I wasn't thinking about anything other than doing what was right. But that didn't mean I wasn't afraid. I found myself pacing the narrow confines of my apartment, late into the night, asking myself the same question over and over: am I ready for this? Was I truly prepared to take on an entire system that was built to protect its own? I could already feel the pressure mounting, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. And yet, I knew there was no way out, no easy way forward. That's when I received the call. It was from Robert, my old mentor at the firm. He had been one of the few people who had taught me everything I knew about law, and his words carried weight. Emma, I need to talk to you, he said, his voice unusually serious. I know what you're about to do. I just want you to understand the full scope of this. This case, it's not just about right and wrong anymore. It's about survival. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to steady my breath. "Don't push this. Don't push it too far," he warned, his tone heavy with caution. "If you keep going, there's no going back. You'll have enemies you didn't know existed. Powerful people. And once you've exposed them, they won't let you walk away from this. I've seen it happen before. Emma, don't make the same mistake I did." His words sent a shiver through me. Robert had always been the kind of lawyer who did whatever was necessary to win. He had never shied away from bending the rules. But now, hearing him so deeply afraid of the consequences, made me question everything. "Robert, I can't back down," I said quietly. "I can't let them get away with it. I have to do this." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Robert finally spoke again, his voice was soft, almost sad. "Then you need to be ready for the fallout. Emma. Be ready for what comes next." I hung up the phone and sat in the dark, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a lead blanket. What had I gotten myself into? Was I ready to face whatever came next? The next morning, I went to the courthouse. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I kept my head held high, my eyes steady on the path ahead. As I walked through the halls, I could feel the eyes of the other lawyers on me, some sympathetic, others cold and calculating. It was a silent acknowledgement of the battle I was about to wage. They knew what I was up against. And yet, as I stood before the judge, my case ready to unfold, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in way over my head. Jason sat beside me, his face pale and strained with fear. He had no idea what was coming, but I could see the hope in his eyes, the belief that I could somehow save him. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for justice. I was fighting for him. For his future. For his life. And for the first time in a long time, I felt certain about something. I wasn't going to back down. The days in the courtroom blurred together. Each day brought new challenges, new pieces of the puzzle that I had to fit together. The prosecution came at us with everything they had: witnesses, documents, expert testimony. They tried to paint Jason as a villain, as someone who deserved to be punished for something he didn't do. The lies were so thick, so tangled. It was hard to see where the truth began and ended. But the more they tried to smear him, the clearer it became to me this was never just about Jason's case. It was a game, a power struggle, and they were willing to sacrifice anyone to win. As the trial went on, I started receiving anonymous messages, cryptic notes slipped under my office door, ominous emails with no sender. At first, I brushed them off, assuming they were just distractions, attempts to intimidate me, but they weren't. They were warnings. The messages became more direct, threatening. Someone didn't want this case to go any further. "You don't know what you're dealing with," one email read. "If you continue down this path, you'll lose more than just your career." The weight of those words hung over me as I sat in court, the tension growing with every passing hour. Every argument I made, every piece of evidence I presented, was met with resistance. But the more I pushed, the more I felt like I was uncovering something much darker, something bigger than I had anticipated. I knew who was behind it. It wasn't just the higher-ups in the firm or the prosecution, they were puppets in a much larger game. The people behind this were untouchable. They had control over the system, over the very fabric of the justice I had sworn to uphold. I could feel them watching me, tracking my every move. But even as fear began to seep into my bones, I refused to back down. Late one night, I stayed at the courthouse long after everyone had left. The stillness of the building felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with unspoken secrets. I stood at the desk in my office, sorting through the evidence. When I heard the door creak open, I spun around, my heart racing. But it was only Jason, standing there, his face drawn and tired. "Emma," he said softly, stepping inside, his voice strained with emotion. I don't know how much longer I can take this. I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weariness that had settled in his posture. He had been through so much. And yet, he was still here, fighting. Fighting for the truth. Fighting for justice. You're not alone in this, I said, my voice steady, even though my own emotions were a tangled mess. I'm not going to let them win. I'll get you out of this. Jason smiled faintly, but there was a sadness to it. A heaviness that weighed down his shoulders. I just don't want to lose any more of myself. Emma. This has already cost me everything. And in that moment, I realized how deeply personal this case had become for both of us. It wasn't just about proving Jason's innocence anymore. It was about redemption. About finding a way to hold on to our humanity in a world that seemed determined to strip it away. I could see that the trial was changing him. It was breaking him. Piece by piece. We're going to win this, I said again. More to myself than to him. But even as I spoke the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both losing. Losing ourselves in the pursuit of something bigger than us. As the trial entered its final stages, the pressure became unbearable. The stakes were higher than ever, and the threats kept coming. But I couldn't let go. I couldn't walk away from the fight, no matter how dangerous it had become. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, I found myself sitting alone in my apartment, staring at the mess of papers on my desk. The walls seemed to close in around me, the weight of everything pressing down on my chest. I thought of Jason, his face, his smile, the hope that still shone in his eyes. I thought of my mentor, Robert, and his warning. And I thought of the price of truth. What was I willing to sacrifice for it? How much of myself could I give before I lost everything? There was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Robert standing there, his face lined with concern. Emma. We need to talk, he said quietly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. You've come too far. You need to let this go. I shook my head. I can't. Robert. Not now. Not after everything that's happened. He looked at me with a mixture of sadness and resignation. Then you're not just fighting for justice anymore. You're fighting for something else. And I'm afraid it's going to cost you everything. I didn't know what to say to that. The room felt too small, too suffocating. But I couldn't back down. Not now. Not when the truth was within reach. The final days of the trial approached. And with them, the tension reached its peak. Every day, I could feel the pressure mounting. It was as if we were all trapped in a cage. The walls closing in. And there was no way out but through. The courtroom had become a battlefield. The audience a silent witness to the slow, agonizing dance of truth and deception. The stakes were clear now. If Jason lost, it wasn't just his life that would be ruined, it would be mine as well. I had become far too invested in this case. And the line between professional duty and personal obsession had blurred beyond recognition. Jason was on the stand again today. His testimony shaking, but his resolve unwavering. He spoke with such sincerity, such pain, that I could see the jury beginning to soften. Yet, the prosecution was relentless. They attacked his character with every tool they had, twisting the truth, distorting his words, and painting him as a cold-hearted criminal. It was infuriating to watch, to know that all of this was a lie. But what could I do? What could anyone do when the system itself was so broken? As the defense rested, the final arguments began. I had spent days preparing mine, rehearsing my words, trying to craft the perfect closing statement. But when the moment came, I found myself standing in front of the jury, unable to speak. The weight of it all hit me like a wave. The years of hard work, the sleepless nights, the endless documents, all of it had led me to this one moment. And yet, all I could feel was a deep, suffocating fear. I looked over at Jason. His eyes were locked on me, searching for something, anything, that could reassure him. But how could I reassure him? How could I reassure myself when the truth was buried so deep under layers of lies and corruption? Taking a deep breath, I began. The words came slowly at first, unsure. But as I spoke, I found my voice. I reminded the jury of the evidence, of the facts, and of the real villain in this case, the system that had allowed all of this to happen. I spoke about justice, about right and wrong, about the human cost of what they were about to decide. I spoke about Jason, about his integrity, his kindness, and his unwavering commitment to the truth, even when it meant facing the wrath of those in power. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. It was a deafening silence, the kind that presses in on you, making it hard to breathe. I felt like I had given everything. My heart was raw. My words had exhausted me, and all that was left was a faint hope that it had been enough. As the jury deliberated, I found myself in a daze. I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept racing back to the moment Jason and I had shared in my office. The raw emotion in his eyes. The quiet strength he had shown throughout this ordeal. And then Robert's warning echoed in my head again. You're not just fighting for justice anymore. You're fighting for something else. What was I fighting for? Was it justice? Or was it redemption? Was I fighting to prove something to myself? To justify everything I had done? Or was I truly seeking the truth? The decision came swiftly. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces unreadable. The judge asked for the verdict, and the room held its breath. Guilty. I felt the words hit me like a punch to the stomach. My knees nearly buckled, but I managed to stay upright. I couldn't believe it. It couldn't be true. How had we failed? How had we let this happen? Jason stood there, his face pale, the weight of the verdict settling over him like a shroud. But it was more than just his failure. It was mine too. I had let him down. I had fought so hard, so passionately, and yet it had all been in vain. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I couldn't. The courtroom was a blur of motion as the judge called for the next case. Jason was led away, his fate sealed by a broken system, and I was left standing there, a hollow shell of the person I had been when this case had begun. I left the courthouse in a daze, the cool night air doing little to clear the fog in my mind. My phone rang as I walked to my car, the caller ID flashing Robert's name. I didn't answer. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to hear his voice telling me that this was how it had to be, that the system had won. I slid into my car, staring at the road ahead, knowing that I had done everything I could. And yet it hadn't been enough. The world seemed colder now, harsher, and I wondered if I would ever feel the same again. How could I go on knowing that I had fought so hard, only to lose? But then I thought of Jason. I thought of his quiet strength, his unwavering belief in the truth. And I realized something. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning. Justice had been denied for now, but that didn't mean it was gone forever. I would find a way to make it right. It wasn't over. Not for me. Not for Jason. And not for anyone who believed in what was just and true. Emma stood tall, feeling the weight of the room pressing down on her. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. Yet somehow, she felt ready. The months of intense study, the countless hours spent poring over legal texts, and the self-doubt she had battled along the way, all of it had led to this moment. She had fought to be here. And now, there was no turning back. Her eyes met the judge's as she began her closing argument. She spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that justice was on her side, but also with the humility of someone who understood the responsibility of the courtroom. Your Honor, this case isn't just about the facts. And it's not just about the law. Emma began, her voice steady but resolute. It's about doing what's right, no matter how difficult it may seem. My client has been wronged, and I stand before you not as an unlicensed teenager, but as someone who believes in fairness and truth. The law is meant to protect, not to silence the innocent. The room fell silent as Emma's words echoed in the space. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her, some skeptical, some curious, but none of them unmoved by the conviction in her voice. She knew this was her final chance, and she would not waste it. For the past year, I have devoted myself to understanding the intricacies of this legal system. I may not have the credentials you expect, but what I do have is a firm belief in the power of justice. And if we deny that power here, today, we do a disservice to every person who believes in the rule of law. My client deserves to be heard, and I will ensure that his voice is not lost in the noise of this courtroom. The judge, a man of imposing presence, shifted in his seat. His demeanor, once indifferent, now showed a hint of consideration. He leaned forward, looking at Emma with newfound curiosity, though still trying to mask his surprise. This was not the defiant teenager he had expected. This was someone who had done their homework, someone who had earned the right to be here. "Miss Carter," the judge said slowly, his voice colder than usual, "I will consider your arguments carefully, but you must understand that the law is not a game, and it's certainly not a stage for theatrics." Emma nodded, her face unwavering. She had been through worse, and nothing in this courtroom could shake her now. She had something stronger than credentials, she had passion. And she had truth on her side. "I don't need a stage, Your Honor," she replied. "I need justice." Her words hung in the air, as the judge's eyes softened for just a fraction of a second. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Even Daniel Hayes, the opposing attorney, who had been so sure of his victory, seemed momentarily caught off guard. He scribbled something quickly on his notepad, his expression momentarily tight with frustration. But Emma didn't look at him. She kept her focus on the judge, on the task at hand. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. "I will deliberate and announce my decision shortly," he said, his voice heavy with authority. "Court is adjourned until further notice." The gavel struck with finality, and Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She had said everything she needed to say. The battle had been hard fought, but it was now out of her hands. Her head swirled with thoughts of her brother, of the injustices she had seen, of everything she had worked for. As she walked out of the courtroom, Emma's body felt both exhausted and elated. She had given her all. She had defended her client with everything she had. And she knew that, no matter what the verdict was, she had won something far more important than a case. She had won a battle for justice, her justice. And with that, she felt a quiet sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but Emma Carter was ready for it. This was just the beginning. Days passed since the trial, but Emma's mind refused to rest. Every conversation, every glance, seemed to remind her of the weight of the case, and she couldn't stop thinking about it. The haunting silence of the courtroom after the final gavel fell echoed in her head, a constant reminder of how much she had staked on this one moment. The decision was still pending, and the wait was excruciating. She spent her days in the small, cluttered office she had rented above a coffee shop, sifting through case files, brainstorming new strategies, and trying to keep her nerves in check. She didn't have the luxury of second-guessing herself. This was the life she had chosen, and this was what it meant to fight for what was right. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Daniel Hayes, the attorney she had been up against. The text was short, but Emma could tell it was not meant to be a friendly gesture. "I hope you're ready for the verdict. This isn't over." Emma scowled at the screen. Daniel had never been one to shy away from a challenge. But this was different. This wasn't about a courtroom win anymore, it was about something more personal. Daniel had made it clear from the beginning that he viewed her as an annoyance, an obstacle that needed to be removed. But Emma wasn't easily intimidated, and she knew that she could handle whatever came her way. She was interrupted by a knock at the door, and when she looked up, she saw her best friend, Leo. standing in the doorway. He looked concerned but also determined. Leo had been there for her since the very beginning, and she could always count on him to bring her back to reality when she was spiraling. "Hey, Leo said, his voice gentle but firm. "You can't keep doing this to yourself. The case is over. And now we just have to wait." "I can't help it," Emma replied, her voice tinged with frustration. "I've worked so hard for this. I can't just sit around and wait for some judge to decide my future. I need to know now." Leo crossed the room and sat down next to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I get it. But you've already done everything you could. There's nothing left for you to prove." Emma sighed, leaning back in her chair. She knew Leo was right. But the pressure was suffocating. She felt as if every fiber of her being was tied to this case, to this moment, and to the fear of failure. But failure wasn't something she could accept. Not after everything she had been through. "Emma, listen to me," Leo continued, his voice steady. "You've been fighting for justice. Not just for your client, but for yourself. No matter what happens with the verdict, you've already won. You've shown everyone that you're capable, that you belong in this world, and you've earned the right to be heard." Emma swallowed hard, trying to ignore the lump in her throat. She had spent so many years feeling like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong in the legal world. But Leo was right. She had fought for a cause she believed in, and she had done it with integrity. That, she realized, was more important than any outcome. The phone buzzed again, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. It was a notification from the courthouse. The verdict was in. Without thinking, Emma opened the message, her eyes scanning the text quickly. The judge had ruled in her favor. Her client had won the case. For a moment, Emma sat in stunned silence, processing the news. The rush of relief that flooded her body was almost overwhelming. She had done it. Against all odds. She had done it. Her hands shook as she texted her client to share the good news. And when she finally looked up at Leo, her eyes were filled with tears. "I did it," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Leo smiled warmly, pulling her into a hug. "I knew you could." As they pulled away, Emma felt a sense of calm wash over her. The battle had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. She had proven to herself, to everyone around her, that she was more than just a girl with a dream. She was a lawyer. And this was only the beginning of her journey. As the months passed, Emma continued to fight. Not in the courts, but in her heart. The weight of the loss never truly lifted, but she learned to carry it with grace. She found new ways to challenge the system, to ensure that the truth would not remain buried. Her passion for justice had only deepened, and with each step, she grew stronger, more determined than ever to make a difference. The journey wasn't easy, but it had changed her, made her realize that victory doesn't always come in the form of a courtroom win. Sometimes, it's about continuing the fight, even when the odds seem insurmountable. And as she walked down a new path, she knew one thing for sure: she would never stop seeking the truth. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to catch more inspiring life stories.